But let's focus a bit more on the supply chain side of things, what the book's really all about, what explains the inflation we've had and what happens next. And I think that the best place to start is your quote, which sounds a bit academic, that supply chains are the economy. But when you actually explain it in the book, it's really rich. It reminds me of Milton Friedman's I, Pencil story, the idea that everything is actually the supply chain. So can you take us through that?
Sure. And it's always good to start with a very simple example. So you go to your local grocery store and you buy a loaf of bread. And if I stop you and say, excuse me, where did the bread come from? They'll go, oh, well, there's a bakery across town. They bake it there and they drive it over here. And you say, okay, yeah, sounds right. But it's in a very nice wrapper, plastic or paper. Well, the wrapper had to come from somewhere. Oh, well, I guess the paper factory on the other side of town made it there and shipped it in, and they put it together in the back room, as the case may be. Well, okay, but how did it get there? Well, it came in a truck, right? And that means who built the truck? How does the truck run? It runs on diesel fuel. Who refined the fuel? It's got a driver. Who trained the driver, et cetera. So even that very simple example, from the bakery to the store, you've got a wrapper manufacturer, you've got a truck driver, and a delivery in a little warehouse or distribution center, and you get it on the shelf. That's a really simple supply chain, but just take it further. So how did the bakery bake the bread? Well, they baked it in an oven. Where did the oven come from? Well, it probably came from 26 countries, because you got tempered glass, steel, semiconductors, monitors, digital controls, and a lot else beside. That had to be put together. That also had to be delivered to you, probably on a truck, some other conveyance. And then that oven manufacturer has its own supply chain from all over the world. Well, okay, so what's bread made out of? It's bread made of wheat. Well, where did the wheat come from? Well, the wheat came from a farm. Okay, how did it get from the farm to the bakery? Well, it had to go through a mill. So to be, the wheat had to be ground into flour, and then the flour had to be transported to the baker before it could be made into the bread. Well, now we got a mill operator somewhere. And then what about the farmer? How did he grow the wheat? Well, he needed seeds, tractors, fuel, these satellite technology, irrigation systems, on and on. Oh, where'd the tractor come from? So you see the point. You can kind of keep going, and every point from the seed to the farmer, to the mill, to the bakery, to the store, and maybe a couple of distribution centers in between, all connected by rail or truck, all fueled with diesel, by the way. Every point on that, what's called the extended supply chain, has its own, think of it as a vertical supply chain intersecting the horizontal supply chain of getting the bread to the baker, and could go on and on and on. But the point is, it becomes very clear once you think about it. What I said in the book was the supply chain is not part of the economy. The supply chain is the economy. There's nothing you can think of. Goods, services, the clothes we're wearing, the chairs we're sitting in, the computer screens or TVs we're watching on, et cetera, that's not the output of some supply chain, whether it's goods or services. And so it really is the economy. And what's happened, and I make the point in the introduction of the book, I talk about a Bronze Age shipwreck discovered in a place called Uluburun, which is in the Mediterranean off the southern coast of Turkey. It was actually found by a sponge diver who was looking for sponges and found some, what he described as jugs with ears. Well, the ears were handles. And this was actually late Bronze Age, about 1200 BC. It's a shipwreck. Well, over the next 10 years, Turkish government, experts around the world engaged in underwater archaeology and excavation, and they came upon the greatest, most intact Bronze Age treasure ever discovered. And in that vessel was there was amber, which comes from the Baltic region. There was gold, which comes from present-day Sudan. There were swords and weapons, which come from Phoenicia at the time, present-day Syria and Israel. There were olives and figs and other foodstuffs, which would have come from Spain or Italy. There was even a carving of Queen Nefertiti, which was no doubt on its way to Alexandria. It was doing a counterclockwise, coastwise trade. Well, that one vessel, if you plot all the points I just mentioned, kind of box it out, it's 5 million square miles. That vessel is at the center of a supply chain either receiving goods or dropping off goods, picking up new ones, et cetera, that covered 5 million square miles. And this is in 1200 BC. So there's nothing new about supply chains, but look at the Silk Road in the medieval period and so forth. What is new, or what was new, beginning around 1989, was supply chain science. This was taking supply chains, which had existed forever, and applying applied mathematics, artificial intelligence, computing power, new algorithms, and also in 1989, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall. 1991, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. 1994 was the real coming out of China. Their economy had started to take off a bit in the 80s, but it was set back in 1989 by Tiananmen Square. It wasn't really until 1994 that they kind of got welcomed back to the party. And then in around 2000, China joined the World Trade Organization. Russia came in a little bit later. But all of a sudden, what I knew when I was a student in the 60s and 70s as an international trading system became globalization. Globalization was kind of a new word in the early 90s, because all of a sudden Russia was in the game, China was in the game, the science was more sophisticated, and now the supply chains didn't go from your farm to bakery to grocery store, as I described, but from Chongqing to New York or from Shanghai to Sydney. These were 6, 7, 8, 9,000 mile supply chains with many inputs and many linkages all along the way. And this was all done in the name of efficiency. If you could get the lowest cost labor, the lowest cost inputs, the lowest cost manufacturing, the lowest cost shippers, et cetera, you could drive prices down, beat your competition, and do well by the consumers. And and it involves I just give a couple examples. Walmart invented a technique. I think it's been around since the Silk Road, actually, but they claim to have invented the modern technique of cross-docking. Well, what's cross-docking? Well, it used to be a truck would arrive at a warehouse, they'd unload the goods, put them in certain places. Then another empty truck would pull up, and they would pick the goods out and put them on the truck and send it on its way. And Walmart said, well, how about the two trucks arrive about the same time and take the goods right off of one truck and put them on the other, skip the warehouse? Well, they did. And obviously that saves a lot of labor costs and storage costs and a lot of other costs. And in fact, Walmart, they call them big box stores. Well, the reason, Walmart or Home Depot or Lowe's, and I'm sure you have your equivalents in Australia, the reason they're so big, the store is the warehouse. You don't need, when the store is that big, you don't need a warehouse. All this stuff is right there to a very great extent. So cutting out warehouses, cutting out distribution centers, cross-docking, and a lot of other techniques, and I explain quite a few of them in the book, reduce costs. So that's a good thing. And it's why we haven't had a lot of inflation prior to last year for a couple of decades. But there were hidden costs. While we were reducing the visible costs, the costs that were easier to understand, we were ringing up hidden costs, and now we're paying the bill. And what do I mean by hidden costs? It's the lack of resilience. It's the lack of robustness. It's that when you have a complex dynamic system that's that highly scaled, that deeply interconnected, and that extended, one little thing breaks down and the whole system breaks down around it. We saw that we saw it become acute in late 2021 with we had a trans-Pacific traffic jam. I mean, the Port of Los Angeles couldn't unload the trucks. So the container cargoes off the vessels, they were stacked 6 high. They can only go 6 high for safety reasons. The trucks were trying to pick them up. They were lined up. They were waiting for days. The truck gets in. Turns out your container is on the bottom of a pile of 6. So you got to move the other 5 to get to yours, et cetera. And vessels were sailing down to Baja California and mooring because they're like, why do I want to stand in line or wait in line in the Port of Los Angeles? They got so bad that vessels in Yokohama and Ningbo, which is the port near Shanghai, were not disembarking. They were not embarking, rather. They were like, hey, what's the point of sailing to Los Angeles? There's nothing to do when I get there. So we had this trans-Pacific traffic jam. But that was the end result of a sort of several-year breakdown of the supply chain, where we became over-reliant on certain ports, certain vessels, certain transportation lanes, certain inputs. And when one or more of them broke down, the whole system collapsed. I give another.
That's the combination here, right? It's the fact that everything is reliant on everything else working. but we gambled on the fact that it all would all work efficiently. And
Correct.
of course, when something went wrong, which was always going to happen, given how how much we pushed the envelope, it wasn't just that particular supply chain broke down with that one particular problem, say COVID in China. It was the whole thing went, because it was all reliant on the other systems all working at the same time, and that's the combination we haven't had before, right?
Right, and I can give you another really concrete example. So take Germany makes great cars. I've driven Audis for over 30 years. My friends in the United States go, I have a German car, I have a Mercedes. I was like, no, it's Mercedes, but it's made in South Carolina. But the Audis are still made in Bavaria, which is right and proper. But the Germans have very sophisticated, very good engineering and manufacturing techniques. But a car has 1,000 miles of wire, just switches and gauges and connections and radios and you name it, an enormous amount of wire. And you can't just sort of throw those wires around the floor of the car on the seats. So you need a conduit. Well, the conduit is a plastic tube. It's articulated and designed to fit the chassis, but it's basically a plastic tube. Well, but that's the first thing you got to put in, because you got to then run the wires and then put the doors on the roof and everything else. You can't do that last. Turns out those conduits were made in Ukraine. Well, they got a little war going on, and all of a sudden the conduits weren't arriving. So Germany here, Volkswagen and Audi had to shut down these multi-billion-dollar assembly lines because they couldn't get one plastic part, but it happened to be the first thing they needed. Well, of course, you call around, you find someone else who can do it, and you get them the molds, but that takes time. And so it shows how, war's not a small thing, war's a huge thing. But it affected a small part that shut down assembly lines in Germany. Again, I could give many other examples, but that's where we got to. And again, as I explained in the book, if you break a vase into 5,000 pieces, you don't get on the floor and pick up the pieces and try to put it back together. You've got to go out and buy a new vase. And the supply chain is now broken, like that vase. The supply chains will carry on; they'll still be around. They're still around today, but much less efficient, much more kind of muddling through, working around, still empty shelves in the grocery stores, depending on what you're looking for. The latest being what I mentioned, which is the over-the-counter medications, because of China's change from zero COVID, which never made medical or public policy sense, to letting it rip. But the Chinese are now hoarding ibuprofen and cough medicines, and we can't get them here or in Australia. So these problems persist. They're going to persist until the new supply chain emerges. But that's going to take 5 to 10 years.
I've written down here that you identified in the book a specific day on which the supply chain breakdown began, but I haven't written down what it is. So hopefully you can remember.
January 2018, have to check the day. It was somewhere around the middle of the month, January 13th, 14th, somewhere in there, but 2018. And that's an important point, Nick, because people, they're very interested in the book. And they're like, hey, we love the history, we love the anecdotes, and we love the analysis. And then we kind of go on and talk about inflation and deflation. But a lot of people say, well, yeah, of course, the war in Ukraine disrupted the supply chain, or of course, COVID disrupted the supply chain. And both of those things are true. The war in Ukraine continues to ripple through, and COVID continues to ripple through. And those were major disruptions to the supply chain, but that is not where it began. It actually started in January 2018 when President Trump launched a trade war with China and put tariffs on imported Chinese goods, specifically solar panels and appliances. Now, these on the face applied to everybody, but China was making most of it. So they were really targeted at China. So all of a sudden, refrigerators, dishwashers, solar modules, was going to be a tariff involved. Well, and I don't want to debate the tariffs. I actually think maybe that was overdue or needed, but you can argue that both ways. But there's no question that he did it, and that was the beginning of how the supply chain collapsed. And again, let me be concrete about that. So China wasn't going to sit there and take it. So what did they do to retaliate? Well, the two largest soybean producers in the world are the United States and Brazil. The largest soybean importer in the world is China, because they need the food. And the U.S. has been in a small trade war arguing with China has been arguing with the United States about the Chinese trade surplus for years. This has been going on a long time. So China was doing what they could to minimize the surplus, given the enormous amount of Chinese goods that Americans were buying. So the Chinese said, well, okay, we'll buy our soybeans from the United States, and that'll reduce the trade surplus. Now, an economist will tell you it doesn't matter. Who cares about surplus deficit? It's just the inverse of the capital account. And who cares if you buy your soybeans from Brazil or the US, because Brazilians will buy something from America. That's true in theory, but in the real world, China wanted to hit us where it hurt. So they immediately shifted all their soybean imports to Brazil, the Brazilian exports to China. Well, think about the magnitude of that. All of a sudden, the Brazilian farmers, they've got to grow more soybeans. They've got to improve their port facilities. Shippers have to change shipping lanes. You got to move the vessels. Don't go to Los Angeles anymore. Go to, Rio de Janeiro or Buenos Aires or wherever the export point is. Insurance arrangements had to be changed. And none of this happens with a phone call. You can do it over time, but if you're any of those parties, you're a shipper, insurance company, a farmer, a port operator, whatever, you don't want a 6-month contract. You want a 5-year contract or a 3-year contract or something that can justify your own expenditures. And they got them. But that was an enormous disruption in and of itself. Now, the U.S. soybean farmers, all of a sudden, they've lost all these orders to ship to China. What do? Well, they call around. Turns out the Netherlands needs soybeans. So we're selling our soybeans to the Netherlands and for distribution in Europe. And same thing. Now you tell your truckers, hey, don't go to Los Angeles, go to Savannah, go to Houston, go to Port Elizabeth near New York. Again, charter vessels, et cetera. Enormous disruption to the supply chain over one item, which is shifting soybeans from the United States to Brazil. And anyway, he could give many other examples like that. Well, fortunately, the data I just described, where are the vessels, what do they have, where are they going, port of disembarkation, et cetera, is all publicly available. You have to know where to look, but you can find that. And you can see the scramble. And there was a study done on that, which I included in my book, included the research in my book. But here's the brilliance of it. It was completed in 2019. So it was all December 2019, this study came out. So it was almost a controlled experiment in what was happening to trade pre-COVID. Because if you had done this in late 2020, you'd be, well, okay, the trade war had an impact, COVID had an impact, but how do I disentangle them? Statistically, that can be very hard to do. But here we had a pure case of a study done pre-COVID, and we can see the disruption happening already. So did COVID make it worse? Absolutely. But it started in January 2018. You can see the disruption over the course of 2018, 2019, pre-COVID.
And that disruption is a good example of that. You use the vase metaphor. I think that you can't unbake a cake metaphor is better. If you make a mistake in the process of making a cake, you can't pull the ingredients back out. You've got to make a new cake. And the old cake's toast. It's not coming back. That's the whole point. Let's skip the 3 causes for the supply chain collapse, because I want to get to the consequences and what Australian investors should be doing about all of this, but I will mention them. The idea that very small changes can have huge impacts in a system that's so complex. The idea that energy inputs have to go up exponentially to try and squeeze a little bit more performance out of the supply chain. The car's a good example of that too. The amount of fuel it takes to get a little bit faster it increases exponentially. And amusingly, leaders are not very good at dealing with these sorts of issues. You talk a lot about how the supply chain system is so complicated, nobody could possibly set it up, nobody could possibly control it. And so when they try and can influence it, it all goes disastrously wrong. But like I said, let's move on to the consequences. You talk a lot about firms that are vertically integrated, being better off in dealing with this problem. And you give the example of Ford as it was. So tell me about that. Do you think companies that are vertically integrated or will vertically integrate will perform better?
Yes, depending on the goods you're making, but that is one solution. There are other solutions. We can talk about those, but Ford is a classic case of the completely vertically integrated firm, to the point Ford had their own forests where they could cut down trees to make, there were a lot of actually wooden parts in early automobiles and dashboards and steering wheels and so forth. They had their own steel mills, so they could produce the steel for their cars. they had their own farms, cattle farms, where they could get the leather to, if you use goods for leather seats, et cetera. So, Henry Ford used to say, we put in steel at one end, a car comes out the other end in 72 hours or whatever. That was the famous River Rouge plant near Detroit, largest industrial facility in the world at the time, and did a good service to the U.S. and the Allies during World War II, because a lot of that manufacturing was converted into making aircraft. They said, hey, keep your car a couple more years. We got to build airplanes. And they did. So that's the vertically integrated firm. That is not typical today. That model worked well for Ford at the time. And that may be coming back. More companies may say, you know what, I can't rely on external supply chains. I have to build my own supply chain where I control it from top to bottom. But that said, my expectation is that the supply chain will be rebuilt. We're not there yet, but actually we're not even close. We have years to go. But it will be rebuilt along the lines of what I call a college of nations. Janet Yellen, who doesn't really understand what we're talking about, she used the phrase friendshoring, like you'll offshore to your friends, not to China, for example. Emmanuel Macron used the phrase constellation of nations. He wants to build a new EU, but more trade oriented, maybe less political, but they all amount to the same thing. And they say, yeah, we'll still outsource, we'll still import, export, we'll still have transportation lanes, but we'll build them, we'll cluster them around like-minded nations that share some values, which would be democracy, liberal outlook, good rule of law. When I say liberal, I'm not getting into liberal conservative debates. I mean, a 19th century sense of liberal, respecting human rights, in other words, constitutional democracies or constitutional monarchy, I guess, in the case of the UK. I remind my Canadian grandchildren that King Charles III is their king. They're like, we don't have a king. I said, yes, you do. You're part of the Commonwealth. He's your king. But that group. So it would include the United States, Canada, Australia, UK, Europe, Japan, New Zealand. They're going to get some good new leadership, so they're back in the club. And they'll trade with each other. And let me give you Again, I like theory's fine, but I like to give concrete examples. So Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the largest and most sophisticated semiconductor firm in the world, based in Taiwan, as the name implies, they just put $40 billion to build 4 new semiconductor fabrication plants, so-called fabs, in Arizona. Not in Taiwan, which is where they're based, not in China, where they have access, or even a nearby country, but in Arizona. Well, why is that? Because, a couple of reasons. Number one, it's consistent with the notion I just described, where a new club of nations will trade with each other, whether it's direct foreign investment, portfolio investment, or import-export, and exclude China. But also, there's a danger, and I don't want to get into predicting dates and so forth, but the danger is uncomfortably high that China will invade Taiwan. And the U.S. military has a doctrine called the broken nest theory. And ironically, the phrase broken nest comes from a Chinese proverb, which says, if the nest is broken, how can the eggs survive? And of course, the implication is they can't. And so if China were to invade Taiwan, either the Taiwanese or the U.S. certainly will burn every facility of Taiwan Semiconductor to the ground, bomb them, sabotage them, blow them up. They'll be destroyed because no one wants to leave that manufacturing capability and technology to the Chinese, so they'll all be destroyed. Taiwan Semiconductor knows that. They're like, okay, we want to survive as a company. We're going to put our flag in Arizona. You may invade Taiwan, but you're not invading Arizona. I'll leave that to the Mexicans, but that's as a separate issue. But the point being, this is how companies will survive, and this is how supply chains will survive. And China will be cut out of the club. China will not be in this club because of... It's
the opposite to Europe's energy policy of the last 20 years, isn't it?
Yeah, make yourself 100% vulnerable and lose your degrees of freedom. In this example I'm giving, where and again, Australia and US will trade. That's fine. There's a lot to do there, but China will be gradually decoupling from them But they're just happy to decouple from us. Xi Jinping, Chairman Xi, is the new Mao Zedong, and seems to have a lot in common with him in terms of more autarkic, insular approach. And of course, China will trade with Russia, and I expect China, they'll still trade with Australia to some extent, and with the South Asian countries, but it'll be greatly reduced. And the drivers of the economy, which are really technology, will be contained in a fairly large, but nonetheless a bubble that I call this College of Nations. And I took the notion a little bit from the League of Nations, often ridiculed, but actually was a fairly powerful force in the 1920s and early 1930s.
And also, you make the point that the decoupling has happened before. And I guess the fall of the Berlin Wall was the mark of the end of that, beginning of the end. But I want to ask you about East Germany's attempt to produce vast amounts of semiconductors, which failed in spectacular fashion, to put it mildly. Do you think this sort of industrial policy and a deliberate attempt, a political attempt to decouple and to do a College of Nations versus the Russia-China axis, do you think that's going to work? Do you think that's going to be economical? Do you think we're still going to be able to buy TVs and all the things we want after all of this plays out?
Yes. Now, I should make it clear, it can work. It doesn't automatically work. There are some constraints. But going back to, I think, 1812 or 1815, David Ricardo, he was considered the inventor of the theory of comparative advantage. And his famous case was, Britain makes great woolens, but they're awful wine, and Portugal has great wine, but they don't have a lot of sheep. And instead of England trying to be in the wine business, doesn't it make sense for England to send their woolens to Portugal and Portugal send their wine to England, and everybody's better off? Well, the answer is yes. And that was based on comparative advantage of two countries and vineyards and sheep herding. But what Ricardo, I won't say he missed it because he kind of referred to it, but 5 generations of economists seem to have missed it, is that comparative advantage is not that simple. Comparative advantage can be manufactured out of thin air with good public policy in two respects. Number one, Ricardo's idea was sort of, that capital was immobile. If you had capital and you had plant and equipment, it was going to stay there. And that was your comparative advantage, labor, trained individuals, et cetera. That's absolutely not true. So whether it was true then, maybe to a much greater extent, but it's not true today. Capital can just pick up and move, and it does. So what if you're China and you have a natural advantage in labor? No one disputes the fact that until recently, China's labor costs were lower, adjusted for quality, than the United States. But they got the capital too. Like you say, kind of like we had the capital and they had the labor. There's something to do there. But what happens when all the capital goes to China, which it did, and now they've got an absolute advantage in everything. So it blows up the idea of comparative advantage. And again, going back to the example of Taiwan Semiconductor, in the early 1980s, what was Taiwan's natural or comparative advantage in semiconductors? It was zero. I mean, they were good at rice, fishing, simple Lego style manufacturing. They had no comparative advantage in semiconductors, but they made a policy decision that they were going to do it. They devoted government resources to it. They attracted, they not only trained their own talent, but they attracted talent from the US to come. If you were Chinese American or Chinese descent, come back to Taiwan, or at least affiliate. So there were kinship ties there. And then they had one of the most enlightened policies. If you were the big brain in some new development inside Taiwan Semiconductor, and you said, I want to leave and start my own company, they say, fine, we'll give you an investment. And they actually encouraged that kind of clustering, if you will, and letting a lot of specialties bloom. And of course, they would buy all the stuff back from them, maybe buy the company back at some point. But so much money was being made. But they pulled that. They have a comparative advantage today. Of course they do. But they created it out of thin air. So, and you can do that with the right amount of capital, government policy. Now, how many governments are enlightened enough to actually do that? How many get that far down the road before the corruption and the cronyism get in the way? How much waste is there? These are all important questions. And I'm not expert on the German case. I take your point, but I don't know how much, green regulation, government bureaucracy, jealousy, Siemens versus, the other big names. I don't know how much of that got in the way. I just don't know, but it can. So that's why I say you can create your own comparative advantage with capital and good policy, but that's easier said than done. However, yes, I do think things like that would go on. And when you say maybe the costs are a little higher, that may well be true, at least initially, but it's kind of worth it. It's the way I describe that, Nick, is we all have homeowners insurance or fire and disaster insurance of some kind, and we hope our homes are fine and we never need it. But if we do, we're glad we have it. But when you write that monthly check or send that digital payment to your insurance company for the premium, you don't think you're wasting your money. You don't think that's money down the drain. You think that's money well spent. It's a cost, but it's worth it in terms of the protection you get. So likewise, in assembling this new supply chain, there will be costs, maybe building vertically integrated semiconductor plants in Germany will be one of them, but the result will be more robust, meaning you'll avoid the hidden costs and the expense of breakdowns or trade wars or financial wars where you're using financial weapons to fight what is actually a geopolitical war, and Ukraine's a good example of that. That's why there's so much buzz these days about not people kind of confuse reserve currencies and payment currencies, same currencies, but they're different channels. The reserve currency status of the dollar, that's a long-term play, not in jeopardy at the moment, but got to watch the space. But the payment currency, what do I pay you in for shipments? There's a lot of ferment there. China's, talking to Saudi Arabia about paying for oil in yuan. The BRICS plus, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but they've now, the plus is they invite Argentina and Turkey and Iran and others to their meetings. They're working on a new payment currency, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a Central Asian group doing the same. Saw a report today that Brazil and Argentina are now discussing a South American currency, roughly equivalent of the euro. I think that has a long way to go. But one of the reasons all these things are happening is because the world sees how the United States has weaponized the dollar to the point, and I thought this was, I warned the Treasury and the Pentagon about this years ago, but to the point that they froze the dollar reserves of the Central Bank of Russia. The central bank of the world's 12th largest economy, third largest or second largest oil exporter, largest natural gas exporter, or second largest, I guess, et cetera. And you're going to freeze the dollar assets of their central bank. And we did. Well, if you're China or Brazil or India or Turkey, you're looking at that and say, hey, maybe we're next. We're going to do something the U.S. doesn't like, and they'll freeze our assets. So that's driving people away from the dollar. I've always said that the world won't destroy the dollar, but the U.S. might do it single-handedly, and we are. And so these are, it's not just a question of supply chains reforming, but financial payment channels, reserve currency denominations are all sort of changing at the same time. So it's has some revolutionary potential.